In 1975, the canals in South Florida had been full of death. Young area women were being abducted, murdered, and dumped in the water at an alarming rate. First, there was Judy Osterling in January, then Barbara Stevens in February, followed by Arietta Tinker and Nancy Fox. As the bodies added up, so did the questions. Were all these murders related? What connections, if any, did the young women have with each other? Who were they even? 2 young women found dead in December of '75 were unidentified. That is, until recently. Thanks to the powerful tool of genetic genealogy, we now know that one of the murdered women had Mississippi beginnings. She had disappeared from the small town of Indianola, nearly 1,000 miles away, and 17 months before her death. Her life and her story may have started out in Mississippi, but for a pair of dedicated detectives, the mystery starts here, in Florida. A woman riding horseback, just 2 days before Christmas in 1975, spotted a dead body floating in the water of a nearby canal. She had been riding along the outskirts of Davie, a small town north of Miami and between Fort Lauderdale and the wet, marshy Everglades of South Florida. The woman rode quickly back to the stables, and police were phoned immediately. No doubt she had been shaken up, but I would wager that she had not been surprised. The canal murders were well known in the community by then, and young women in the area had been on alert for months. There had been tremendous pressure on the police to find the killer or killers, but despite this, the murders have remained unsolved even to this day. Modern technology has been unable to bring justice to the many young victims of the 1970s canal killings, but it has helped to make some recent progress. The unidentified body found in the canal that late December remained a doe for 46 years. For decades, she was known solely for her sad, untimely death and the necklace that she had been found wearing. But finally, the hard work of detectives and genetic scientists have given her back her name, and perhaps given us some new clues to solve a decades-old mystery. Thanks to their time and dedication, we now know more about Puka Shell Jane Doe and the South Florida canal killings. Many South Florida canals were built by the Army Corps of Engineers following severe flooding in the late 1940s. Their many purposes included lowering water levels and moving water underneath new roadways in developing areas. They were well established by the 1970s, when a serial killer, or several, began to use them as a dumping ground for young women. The deaths had started slowly that spring, and then, as the heat of summer hit, the body count began to rise. 2 14-year-olds, 8th grade friends from Hollywood, Florida, Barbara Schreiber and Belinda Zederauer, had gone missing mid-June of 1975. They were last seen together walking to a friend's house. Their bodies were found before they were even reported missing. Both of them had been shot to death on the bank of the South Broward County Canal. It was less than 150 yards from the location where 19-year-old Nancy Fox had been found just 4 days earlier. In July, 14-year-old Robin Loesch was found dead in another canal, half a mile away. Then, quickly, the 2 back-to-back killings widely known as the Flat Tire Murders. 27-year-old Ronnie Gorlin didn't return home after heading out to run errands. Her car was found abandoned at the mall on 163rd Street. The tires had been slashed. The next day, her body was recovered from a canal nearly 14 miles to the west. 1 week later, it was 21-year-old Elise Rapp, who had also been last seen at a shopping center. Just like Ronnie Gorlin's, her tires were slashed. Both were found murdered in a canal off of Northwest 138th Street. Police believed that the manipulative murderer had knifed the young women's tires and then approached them to offer help. Dade County Deputy Chief Medical Examiner Ronald Wright told the Miami News that he felt that the killer was a young white man in his 20s, a good-looking, all-American type who may have been married but was interested in the sexual mutilation of girls. And there were lots of girls, too. Many more who disappeared suspiciously, only to be found in or near the canals. Even another unidentified woman, found just 10 days earlier than Puka Shell Jane Doe. She was discovered in a wooded area of West Broward, directly south of our Jane Doe. It was reported that her death was also being investigated as a homicide, but I found her described only once in the Miami Herald as a white female between the ages of 18 and 35. And that's it. This Jane Doe only appears a few times in the media before disappearing completely. There were so many canal killings, all pretty young women dumped in or near canals, all unsolved. Police believed that some of them were connected to each other. The 14-year-olds abducted together, certainly. The flat tire murders as well. But what of the others? What about Puka Shell Jane Doe? Investigators believed that she had been in the water between 5 and 10 days. She had been found clothed, wearing a long-sleeved green flowered blouse, blue flared pants, and blue platform shoes. They estimated her to be between 20 to 30 years of age, 5 foot 5 inches tall, and weighing 123 pounds. She had medium-length brown hair, brown eyes, and a wide gap between her two front teeth. While she earned her nickname, the Puka Shell Jane Doe, for her black and white puka bead necklace, she had also been wearing a large blue ring on the ring finger of her left hand. No leads were generated when her description was published in the Miami area back then. Publicly, Broward County Sheriff Ed Stack discounted the theory that her death was connected to the dozens of other canal-related deaths that had occurred that year. The location of the canal that the 2 December does was found in was east of Highway 27, while most others were west or nearer to the highway. Perhaps in response, or by coincidence, in January of 1976, the next month, 17-year-old Michelle Winters was found strangled to death by her own purse strap in another canal, east of Highway 27. Was there a serial killer? A pattern of violence? Julie Wilson wrote for the Orlando Sentinel that the women had been either bashed in the head or shot, and most had been sexually molested and stripped of clothing. However, some had not been. Some had been found, like Puka Shell Jane Doe, fully clothed. Some women were found with no visible signs of trauma on the body, and others so mutilated that a Dade County medical examiner compared the killer publicly to Jack the Ripper. A reward had been announced, $6,000 to anyone who could furnish information leading to an arrest. But none of the leads panned out. Families waited for justice, but no justice was served. After the loss of so much innocent life, the community must have been filled with sadness and grief. But time marches on. Finally, in the spring of 1976, the deaths slowed, and the canals were quiet. When interviewed in September of 1976, Metro Homicide Detective Charles Major said that with no new murders following the canal killer's pattern, the investigation had cooled. He considered it a possibility that the killer had left the region. They had followed leads and possible links to murders in other states, but those investigations had been unproductive. Perhaps the cases were not related at all. He said, "The fact is that canals are the big, convenient place in this area to dispose of bodies. It's possibly just a coincidence that they were found in canals. There were no major developments or movements in the investigation until the Davie, Florida Police Department started a cold case unit in 2019. Detective Eddie Velasquez told the Mississippi newspaper The Enterprise-Tocsin, "As we decided to move forward with starting a unit, we decided we needed to start with a case, and we started with this 1975 case to really put our hearts and souls into it. And we did." Even with all their heart and souls, it was a difficult task. Unfortunately, even some of the information in their files were incomplete or incorrect. Cold case detective Velasquez and crime scene technician Bertha Hurtado had the pages from Jane Doe's original autopsy, which listed her cause of death as drowning. However, the medical examiner back then didn't go into detail or express whether he believed it was an accident, a murder, or a suicide. Detectives had treated it as a homicide, but the files indicated that most of her body had been cremated back in the 1970s. Still, they found that her maxilla and mandible had been saved as evidence. Those two jawbones were used to create a composite sketch. When that sketch produced no leads, the detectives continued. They spoke with the medical examiner's office, whose files indicated that actually the Doe's body had been buried and not cremated. Unfortunately, the details of her burial were not available, so detectives continued their hunt. They called area funeral homes until they reached Forest Lawn in Davie. Their record showed that Puka Shell Jane Doe had been buried just 3 miles from the police department. Velasquez went to work on an exhumation warrant. "That was one of the most important steps, to exhume her body," Ms. Hurtado said to reporters. Once they had more bones to work with, forensic anthropologists put together a new sketch of the murder victim. But, like before, there were still no leads. They also extracted DNA from the Jane Doe, which was sent to Parabon NanoLabs for DNA sequencing. Unfortunately, Jane Doe's exhumed body had been contaminated with bacterial DNA, which can degrade the victim's actual DNA. This one took a lot of work by our scientists at Parabon, Chief Genetic Genealogist CeCe said. Thankfully, they were successful in separating the bacterial DNA so that Jane Doe's information could be uploaded to GEDmatch. "We're just hoping for a second, third, or fourth cousin to this unknown individual. We get a list of people who share DNA," the acclaimed genealogist explained. "Normally, it would be really straightforward. I would build the match's family trees, figure out the common ancestors between them, and then build forward in time from those ancestors and find the missing woman." But this case wasn't so straightforward. After many, many hours of investigation, Moore traced the family line to Neshoba County, Mississippi, 900 miles from Davie, Florida. Geneticists gave cold case detectives a few names of people to reach out to, and one of them agreed to provide his DNA. This person proved to be an even closer relative than before. The additional DNA allowed Moore to focus on another branch of his family. Eventually, detectives learned about a woman missing from Mississippi from the 1970s. They reached out to the woman's sister, who put them in contact with the missing woman's 2 daughters. Daughters who had been missing their mother for 46 years. A DNA test confirmed what detectives believed. Their unidentified Jane Doe was Carolyn Dunn Moudy. Carolyn Moudy had been born Carolyn Jeanette Dunn on December 24, 1953. She grew up in Philadelphia, Mississippi in Neshoba County. Her mother left her when she was just 11, disappearing without a trace in 1964. Her father was a farmer, and at some point he moved the family to Sunflower County, 150 miles to the west. They built a life in Indianola, Mississippi. So little is known about Carolyn. There are very few photos of her. No record could be found of her in area schools or yearbooks. At some point as a teenager, she marries her husband, David Earl Moudy, the father to her 3 girls. While there's not a lot on record for Carolyn, her husband is another story. David Earl Moudy does not appear to be a responsible parent or partner for his wife. According to court records, David was an alcoholic who was constantly in trouble with the law. He faced charges for assault and battery in 1972, malicious mischief and trespassing in June of 1974, the month before his wife went missing. Sadly, the couple's first baby died during childbirth. She arrived in 1971 when Carolyn was just 17 years old. They named her Carolyn Denise. It appears common in David and Carolyn's family to name babies after yourself or a close relative. It makes it a little confusing with multiple people having the same name, but there were several examples of this, so I found it not surprising, though still heartbreaking, that her second baby she names Carolyn too, Carolyn Jeanette. Carolyn was a young mother and just 20 years old in the summer of 1974 when she went to the South Sunflower Hospital to give birth to their 3rd daughter. It is said that Carolyn walked away from her family while her newborn baby, named Edna, was still in the hospital, just 3 days old. What kind of heartbreak and trauma could cause a mother to walk away from her new infant just 3 days postpartum? Her second daughter, named Carolyn, but goes by Jeanette, was not even 2 at the time. She says that she recalls the individual her mother reportedly left with, even though she was very young. How that can be or who this person may have been was not shared in interviews. She shouldn't have left, Jeanette said, admitting to the media that she was bitter for many years about her mother leaving. However, she has had a recent change of heart since receiving the news of her mother's death in Florida. Now I regret the stuff I said. Edna, who never really met her mother, had long since forgiven her. In 2021, they visited the canal, and the personal items their mother was found wearing, the ring and necklace that she was known for so long, were given to her daughters. Today, Jeanette wears the ring while Edna has the necklace. They also brought home their mother's cremated remains. A private service was held for Carolyn Jeanette Dunn Moudy at the Indianola City Cemetery December 24th, 2021, Carolyn's birthday. While now at least they know why their mother never came home, they still have lots of questions. She had to lay her head somewhere, Edna said to reporters. Where was their mother for the 1.5 years between her disappearance and her death? The 2 women want to know more about their mysterious mom and what she was up to while she was alive. And so do detectives. More information about their murder victim could lead them to a killer. In the course of their investigation, they learned that Carolyn's own mother, who had gone missing in 1964 when she was just 11, had actually been alive and living in Florida. For 42 years, she stayed hidden from everyone she knew in Mississippi. She died in 2006 before anyone discovered her location or Carolyn's identity. Was this a coincidence? So far, it's unclear if there is a connection between Carolyn's mother and her presence in Florida in 1975. But detectives are focused on learning more about that and about Carolyn's life back in the 70s. We're definitely working different angles from this point forward. We're working toward that direction, at least trying to identify who was involved in her murder, said Detective Velasquez. Back in Mississippi in 1974, Carolyn's 2 young daughters moved in with their father's mother, their grandmother, also named Edna Moudy. Jeanette became more than a sister to little Edna, often stepping in to act as mom. They see their father, David Earl, infrequently as he continues to get in trouble with the law. He faces charges for reckless driving, driving under the influence, disturbing the peace, and driving without a license, all just in 1975. He also files for divorce, and summons for Carolyn's appearance are printed in the local paper. When she does not appear, his divorce is granted, and he remarries. David's lawlessness continues, and in 1976 he is sentenced to 2 years for burglary. The time spent in jail is not rehabilitative, and in 1979 he's sentenced to 8 years for aggravated assault. However, he's out quickly, in just 2 years on a work release program, and within a month, in early 1981, he's charged with the capital rape of a 10-year-old. A neighborhood girl the same age of Moudy's own daughter had been playing at his home while he had been drinking. She went with him to pick up a relative, and he pulled over to rape her en route to his aunt's home. Dr. Giovanni Croce, state criminal psychologist, testified to Moudy's low intelligence level, either due to poor education or possible mental problems. He said that Moudy should have received psychiatric help a long time ago. After pleading not guilty and testifying at his own trial, he changed his plea to guilty and received a sentence of life in prison, where, according to his children, he died. Left without either parent, Jeanette and Edna have at least some answers when it comes to their mother's life. Years of technological advances paired with many, many hours of heart, soul, and sweat have brought a little bit of closure for the two. "It was amazing," said crime scene technician Bertha Hurtado. "Quite frankly, these are emotions that you just can't articulate. Even to this day, everything seems so surreal." These are successes that should be celebrated. Thanks to the Davie Police Department, to Parabon NanoLabs, and the many individuals that worked on this case, the Moudy family has some closure. But there are still many questions to be answered. Is there a December 13th, 1975 Jane Doe to investigate? Or was she identified long ago? Is there other evidence from the South Florida canal killings that could be tested for DNA? Perhaps even the killer's DNA. Who killed Carolyn? Who took the lives of the many young, innocent women that make up the South Florida canal killings?